Hi, Daniel.
Hi, Bob. How are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Not too bad.
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You are Daniel McCarthy, formerly editor of The American Conservative, now editor of Modern Age, a conservative review. You write for both The Spectator and The American Conservative. No, you write monthly for what? You write monthly for The American Conservative? Is that it?
Oh, for The Spectator, for the U.S. print edition.
You write monthly. I'm really glad to be able to talk to you because you voted for Donald Trump. You're very good at presenting the perspective, I think, of a lot of Trump voters and analyzing that perspective. And I think we don't hear enough from that. By we, I mean those of us who didn't vote for Donald Trump don't hear enough from that side of the fence. And with impeachment proceedings underway, I think it's a good time to check in. And I wanted to talk to you about impeachment, but also about other things, about the whole thing. So let's start by talking about how why you think impeachment has been a political mistake for the Democrats, and perhaps a mistake that derives partly from what you see as their misunderstanding of the Trump phenomenon. If that's all, is that all fair?
I think that's fair. This is the first. This is an impeachment that's happening the same year as a election. It seems to me that Democrats might have actually been better served, for their own purposes, even in terms of partisanship, simply by having investigations and hearings, not going through with an impeachment, but keeping the pressure up on the Trump administration through to the election. An impeachment becomes a circus. I mean, it's an attempt to remove a president. I think voters look at that and see that as being potentially an attempt to do an end run around them, either to negate the last election or to influence conditions going into the 2020 election. And it does seem to me that one of the angles here is not just about Trump, but also about the United States Senate. Depending on how the impeachment proceedings had gone, there was the potential that Republicans in the Senate might have been embarrassed to try to support the president. They might have wound up in difficult positions in the 2020 November elections. And the way things have worked out, I think it's actually going to be the opposite. I think it's, Doug Jones in Alabama, for example, might be in an awkward spot because of, if he votes to convict and remove President Trump, that could hurt him very badly with his voters in Alabama. I think in the long run, it's probably difficult as well for people like Joe Manchin in West Virginia. So the politics of this have not worked out in a way that favors the Democrats. And I think voters in general don't find impeachment to be the proper venue for adjudicating these kinds of questions. Okay.
Now, I think the conventional wisdom is that you're departing from the conventional wisdom there with that assessment. I think the conventional wisdom, as I've heard it kind of on the Democratic side, is that this will play out differently in the two houses of the legislature, that it could hurt Democrats in one, in the House, not in the Senate, or maybe it's the other way around. Is your view that it's going to help Republicans in both the House and the Senate?
It seems to have that potential. I mean, within the House, when they did their vote to send the charges over to the Senate, two Democrats defected from the rest of the Democratic caucus, which is a sign of a little bit of discomfort among Democrats, House Democrats, with respect to the impeachment proceedings. People tend to, forget the way the 2018 midterm elections worked out, which actually were quite favorable towards moderate Democrats, as opposed to the more hardline left-wing progressive Democrats. And you could have a lot of House districts, where you find that impeachment actually doesn't play as a very strongly favorable card for House Democrats. But I mean, we'll find out in a few months' time here. I think the Democrats have made a miscalculation, but certainly there was a very strong demand from the activist base of the Democratic Party to get Nancy Pelosi to proceed with an impeachment proceeding. They felt that it was now or never.
Okay. By the way, I wanted to locate kind of that activist base a little more precisely, because there was one thing you wrote recently. I think this was in The Spectator, that that I think I kind of take issue with. Or maybe I just didn't understand you correctly. You wrote, but Nancy Pelosi's leadership in the House is now more responsive to the activist wing of the Democratic Party, the wing driven above all else by hatred for Donald Trump, than to the moderates who stand to pay the price for the activist left's vendetta. Now, my take is that if by left, you mean kind of the far, socialist or quasi-socialist left, a lot of them are less exercised about Trump and Trumpism than the kind of conventional liberals, right? I mean, certainly the kind of Glenn Greenwald left believes, I think, along with you, that people to their right, people closer to the center in the Democratic Party, are making a mistake with their Trump obsession. So, do you differ from that assessment, or?
No, I actually agree with what you're saying. In talking about the left, there are a couple of different ways that phrase can be used, just as there are when talking about the right and conservatives. So I'm thinking there of sort of the MSNBC viewership. So from a Republican perspective, they're not moderates exactly. They do appear to be to the left of, where Donald Trump is, certainly to the left of, sort of conventional conservatives. But they're not the Glenn Greenwald left. They're not the sort of socialist left necessarily. They are the left wing of the sort of liberal branch of the Democratic Party, as opposed to the really strongly ideologically focused sort of socialist progressive left.
Yeah. But because I think of the kind of most fervent part of the resistance as including a lot of hardcore Hillary supporters. And she certainly in Democratic terms is a moderate, right? Yeah,
I think that that makes sense. It's Hillary Clinton supporters. It's, I think, people who spend their days watching Rachel Maddow on MSNBC. It's not people who are reading Glenn Greenwald or people who are reading Jacobin magazine, for example.
Okay. So do you think that kind of all along Democrats have misunderstood the prospects for actually persuading people? I mean, there was, don't you think that there is in the Democratic Party, or there was at least at some point months ago, the belief not just that going through the impeachment process would be good for them politically, but that they could actually get a conviction, which now seems very unlikely, right? Do you think that was, first of all, do you think that's true? There was a real hope for actual conviction, A, and B, if so, do you think that was founded on fundamental misconceptions about the nature of Trump's support or nature of the American electorate, or what?
It's a good question. I think there was probably a real belief that they could secure a conviction by persuading enough Republicans to go along with them. I think they were sort of living in a bubble in that respect. They were mistaken to believe that that the way that impeachment would play out with highly partisan votes, in terms of the charges, would sway Republicans. If you look at how this was happening, there was never a point where it seemed as if House Republicans were starting to be won over by the Democratic case. And again, even the Democratic caucus had a couple of defections from it. The public case was never something that seemed to be getting to the point where an overwhelming number of the public, over 50%, was going to support impeachment. The case was weak to begin with. It just wasn't the kind of thing that was likely to compel an avalanche of, sort of support such that you would have the numbers you need in order to really convict and remove a president. So I think there was a little bit of wishful thinking involved on the Democrats' part at the very beginning.
Do you, and you don't think, there's been a recent emergence of some new evidence, or at least a more colorful version of evidence that something untoward may have been going on with respect to Ukraine? But you don't think this has any potential to change things conviction wise?
I think it's difficult to insert the new material into a impeachment proceeding that's already underway and when charges have already been formulated. If there are going to be hearings about Lev Parnas or about some of these other new revelations, that could lead to, a kind of new sequence of events. But I think, in part, this shows the downside to proceeding with impeachment when, in fact, there was still plenty of questions open. There was still a lot to be, done before you get to the point of having charges drawn up and sent to the Senate. This should be, this should remain in the political realm right now. This should be something that's decided in the 2020 election, as opposed to being something that becomes a quasi-legal proceeding, a quasi-judicial proceeding with impeachment. So I think the Democrats jumped the gun. They should have kept this open. They should have, instead of having impeachment sort of set in stone at this point, they should have still been going through with hearings and with the campaign to persuade the public, and then make this a political issue in 2020. Don't make it, a quasi-judicial proceeding in January of 2020.
Okay, yeah, well, they did. I mean, Nancy Pelosi seems to be in kind of a hurry to get it over with, right?
She's in a tough position. Again, this is why I think that there's a certain activist part of the Democratic Party, whether we call it the left or something else, the MSNBC branch of the party perhaps, which really pressured Nancy Pelosi very strongly to proceed with impeachment in an expedited fashion, or to have it at all, right? I think Nancy Pelosi had actually resisted the idea of having impeachment proceedings up until last fall. And Pelosi's political instincts, I think, are much stronger and much surer than those of the sort of very overenthusiastic part of the base.
Yeah. But do you think, it matters really whether this evidence can get inserted in the process? Because that is in the kind of judicial process in the Senate. I mean, it seems to me that ultimately what senators are going to respond to is their perception of what voters want. I mean, if you suddenly saw like a 10% swing from the, in the favor of impeachment, right, and parts of Trump's actual base started deserting him, it seems to me that you might have potential for a conviction. But and the evidence is out there, right? Whether it's in the proceedings or not, the evidence is there, and it just doesn't seem to be having that kind of impact, right? And I guess I'm asking, isn't there a solid enough chunk of people who just aren't going to favor impeachment for anything short of Trump actually shooting somebody on Fifth Avenue, that it doesn't really matter whether you put the evidence in or out or what? Am I being, too cynical or something about that?
I think you've got a high degree of skepticism that's built in among supporters of Donald Trump right now, and overcoming that skepticism is a monumental task, and it's not made easier by the fact that you've had this impeachment proceed in the way that it has. But new evidence being considered in the public forum right now, being discussed, in the media and also in various investigative proceedings. That counts for something. And I think there are, people out there, they may not be the hardcore Donald Trump base, but there are voters out there who would like to learn more about what was going on, whether or not you had this sort of stalking and intimidation of a U.S. ambassador and things like that, all of which is a little bit removed from the core issue. The core issues of impeachment right now. It's all part of this very messy situation involving whatever freelance activities, Giuliani was undertaking in Ukraine, how much Donald Trump had, sort of directly supervised or commissioned any of that, and then sort of how much Giuliani was aware of some of the things that the people he was associated with were then undertaking, either for their own agendas or because of cues they had received from Giuliani. I think all of that is actually very messy. It's worth investigating. It's worth sort of picking apart. But trying to bundle that into an impeachment proceeding that's already underway, I think is just very awkward. And people have already made up their minds based on everything the House was doing months ago. And that makes it actually much harder to consider these new questions. Okay.
And this is kind of a parenthetical question because I don't think we should dwell on this. But just to be clear on your position, what do you think about the magnitude of the alleged transgression? I mean, let's assume that indeed, as it seems to me, is the case, Trump withheld funding to Ukraine. And by the way, only in the last week or so, the government agency that I guess makes these calls, the federal government agency that makes these calls, has said that part was I guess technically illegal in and of itself. I mean, he didn't actually have the authority to withhold that. So he was exceeding his presidential authority according to this ruling, this executive branch ruling, as I understand it, just in withholding the funds, leaving aside why he did it. But let's assume that indeed, as alleged, and as pretty clearly seems to be the case, he was withholding the funds to kind of strong-arm the Ukrainian government into doing a couple of things. I guess mainly announce an investigation into the whole Biden thing, and I guess ideally proceed with the investigation. And then also to do something or other suggesting that maybe it was Ukrainians more than Russians that had been meddling in various things before the election. So, and let's assume that those can be construed as kind of personal political favors. They were for his political good, not he wasn't thinking of them as being for the good of the public or the government or anything. A, do you accept that basically that happened, and B, do you not think that merits impeachment?
On the question of motives, it seems to me that Donald Trump really does believe quite sincerely that Ukraine had been involved in the 2016 election, had been, sort of taking a side against him, had already meddled in our election. Now, maybe we can understand why Ukrainians might have been inclined to do that if they did, because, of course, Ukraine is in a very difficult relationship with, a country next door that has sort of mutilated their territory, that has, annexed Crimea and so forth. Trump was seen not only here in the U.S., but also abroad as being rather more sympathetic to Russia than certainly Hillary Clinton would have been. And so the Ukrainians had a stake in that fight. Trump, I think, really does believe that Ukraine had meddled in the election, and that what he was doing in asking the new Ukrainian leader to open an investigation into Hunter Biden and his relationship with Burisma, and also, in this transcript, this telephone call, which became the basis for the whistleblower complaint and everything that's followed, Trump was interested in, this question of did the Ukrainians somehow obtain a DNC server that would have shed light on the nature of the hacking attacks on the DNC in 2016. I think Trump really does believe that stuff, and I think it's implausible. I think the truth at the heart of the matter there is probably not what Donald Trump believes. But if you believe that this kind of interference in U.S. Politics is taking place, and if you believe that there are questions of illegality here, asking a foreign government to investigate and to find out the truth about what happened is not improper. And as far as using the leverage of U.S. Foreign aid as a way to encourage the foreign government to do that, this is something that I think U.S. government not just the Trump administration, but other administrations often do, not in terms of an investigation like that, perhaps, but certainly in terms of anti-corruption policies and so forth. And even Joe Biden in the past has, talked about the possibility of withholding aid to Ukraine in order to get the kind of anti-corruption measures that he wants. So that's how I look at it. Donald Trump, going off of his own beliefs about what happened in 2016 and the idea that there is some sort of corruption involving U.S. politics in Ukraine, was seeing this as being a way to shed light on what was happening and using foreign aid as an encouragement to get the Zelensky administration to investigate this. How far that would have gone is, I think, an open question. Was Donald Trump really going to permanently try to impound the foreign aid, something which would have been, beyond his powers as president? Was this simply a little bit of, sort of slowing down the process in order to provide a little bit of pressure, but not something that was overwhelming? Zelensky himself has said that he didn't feel as if he was intimidated into trying to cooperate with President Trump. And, Zelensky, you might say, well, he obviously would want to please Trump. He wouldn't want to tick him off. But Zelensky actually has to think also about whether what he's saying is ticking off Congress, because, of course, it's Congress that actually approves this foreign aid to Ukraine. And President Trump, if anything, is rather less supportive of the idea of sending any U.S. aid to Ukraine. Well, yeah, so those are the conditions that I see as being sort of the background to all of this. As far as the GAO's ruling about the president's authority to withhold or slow down this aid in the first place, the Government Accountability Office, as Newt Gingrich renamed it. It was formerly the General Accounting Office. But GAO is a legislative branch agency. It is a division of Congress, basically. And quite unsurprisingly, it tends to take Congress's line when it comes to the separation of powers. So I would not see the GAO ruling as necessarily being the final word here. I mean, really what would happen is that if it seemed as if Donald Trump was holding up any kind of foreign aid that Congress had approved for any country whatsoever, and there was a interbranch dispute about this, it would go to the courts. And in the past, the courts have ruled the president has very limited powers of impoundment, that in fact, he can't completely withhold funds that Congress has approved. But I wonder if the Supreme Court would in fact, say that there is some leeway here for the president to take a little bit of time to make sure that the money he's providing that's been authorized by Congress is being used by a government that is trustworthy.
Okay, so I was wrong in thinking that the GAO is in the executive branch. But just to be clear and make sure I didn't miss something or misunderstand something, you think he is sincere in his belief that the Ukrainians meddled in the election? And hey, a lot of people can meddle in the election at the same time. It's not crazy to think that some are Ukrainian, I guess, and some, which of course is different from thinking that all of the meddling attributed to the Russians was in fact the Ukrainians, which he may well believe, which strikes me as less plausible. But that aside, are you saying that you also think he's sincere in his belief that there was genuine Biden corruption and he was really bringing something important to into the spotlight by pushing for that investigation?
I think there is genuine corruption here. Now, whether it's illegal corruption is the key question. I mean, when you are someone who has Hunter Biden's reputation and record, and you're being brought on to an oil company, a field that you don't really have any experience in, and being paid $50,000 a month in order just to sit on the board, there's something fishy going on there. That's not something that happens to ordinary people who aren't named Biden, right?
Yeah.
So Donald Trump looks at that. He says, okay, there's clearly something going on here. Now, with Donald Trump, the question of where the line is drawn between things that he finds suspicious and things that he finds to be illegal, President Trump is probably not making the kinds of distinctions that other people would make, not necessarily for partisan reasons, but because that's in the nature of Donald Trump. And we saw this in the 2016 election, and I think we've continued to see that since then. Now, there's an upside to this, right? So on the one hand, I'm criticizing Donald Trump here a little bit because I'm saying, he may be inclined to see improper behavior as necessarily illegal behavior, and I think that most of us would say that that's not the case. On the other hand, this is something that it seems to me if you don't take the Donald Trump point of view, if you don't kind of go farther than most people would go in terms of questioning these kinds of business relationships, that the story here would just never get the degree of attention it actually deserves. And the Hunter Biden Burisma story was something that The Nation and other publications had covered, years ago even. And but it was something that just hadn't reached the level of being a public question. The ordinary American had not thought about it. Whereas now I think there's this question, what should the relationship be between political families and, sort of foreign companies and foreign governments?
Yeah. No, I think it's a good question. I think there's no doubt that Burisma was hoping to use Biden's son as leverage and was paying him to do that. I think, and I assume in legal terms, the question would be whether Biden actually did them a favor for that reason. And I guess there are tons of situations like this where there are dubious payments made to family members of and it is, as they often say, the appearance of conflict of interest, at least an oblique kind of conflict of interest, since the payment goes to family member, not the person. But that, just one last question on this. And in a way, maybe this just gets at an issue of human psychology that we really can't, is unfathomable. We can never really determine the answer to a question like this, but because, the whole question of what is a person's conscious motivation as opposed to unconscious motivation is always complicated. I think it's in a way even more complicated in the case of Donald Trump's very unusual brain. But I mean, don't you think that the core motivation for all of this, I mean, Donald Trump has never shown the slightest principled concern about corruption per se, right? It's not like he's, Ralph Nader or somebody just calling it out wherever he sees it or something. Don't you think it's pretty clear that in some sense, in his brain, the ultimate motivation for this whole thing is the political interests of Donald Trump?
Not exactly. I think he sees himself as having been wronged back in 2016, and he sees that as, even though he's personally involved in it.
Wronged in the accusation that the Russians, wronged in what way?
That's right. No, he thinks that both in 2016 and then into the, his administration, he has been set up or, maligned for a Russian relationship, for the, the Steele dossier, for all of this. Mm-hmm. And he thinks that there is a constellation of forces, both here and abroad, that's responsible for doing that. So even though he is, a player in this, he is someone who's personally involved and invested. I think he also thinks that this is a genuine, it's not simply that he's looking out for some sort of, let me put it this way. He doesn't see himself as the aggressor here. He sees himself as the aggrieved, as the victim. And therefore he thinks that what he's doing is a genuinely, legitimate defensive measure.
Okay. So let's step back and get back to something we kind of touched on, which is things that Democrats or maybe people in the resistance don't understand about the nature of Trump's support. You can frame this in terms of impeachment. Why were they so sure impeachment was going to be a good idea politically? Or just in terms of the election, why were they surprised by the outcome of the election? I guess you'd agree there's some overlap. The answers to those two questions have some overlap, right? And if I'm right about that, what is the overlap? What's kind of the core thing that you think people don't get about Trump support, why he's president, why he keeps defying their attempts to kind of get him?
I think it goes beyond Trump to the sort of class division that we've created in this country. And it's a class division that's primarily demarcated by education as opposed to by income. So a lot of people who have, sort of consensus views of things that are drawn from their experience in education and then their professional experience among other educated people, they can't conceive that anyone might have the kinds of radical objections to what's going on in this country in terms of economics, in terms of, sending jobs abroad, in terms of, a sort of rather lackluster enforcement of the border. All of these things that Donald Trump capitalized on in 2016 are just non-issues for a very large part of the middle class and upper middle class in America. And even now, they can only really conceive of Donald Trump's election and the fact that Donald Trump seems to be well-positioned to survive impeachment. They can only really conceive of that as a kind of pathology on the part of Donald Trump's supporters. They can only see this as these people really are like us in terms of their thinking, in terms of their education, in terms of their sort of professional outlook. They understand that, sort of the demands of the global economy are what they are. And they're just being perverse, or they're just being sort of lazy, or being resentful, or being hateful by supporting Donald Trump and trying to spoil a system that everyone knows is a good system and is a system that works. I think they're wrong about all of that. That in fact, for large portions of the American public, the ones who don't have a higher education might not have the ability to sort of conceptualize it the way that I would. But for a large number of Americans, they have an intuitive understanding that they're getting run roughshod over by their leaders in politics, but also by corporate America, by by Hollywood and so forth. They don't feel as if they have any representation, and they don't feel as if their interests are being defended at any level. So Donald Trump comes along, and he's, a kind of chaotic individual. He's saying and doing things that are sort of all over the map. But they see him as someone who is also not part of this consensus culture, someone who has the potential to disrupt it, and someone who at least from time to time talks about issues that seem to matter to the factory worker, or to someone who is sort of living in an area that's been devastated by the opioid epidemic. And they say, so this guy is a force who's going to, to some degree represent our interests and represent our perspective and our voice. And therefore, we're going to support him, and we're going to stick to him, even if the going gets tough, even if, for example, some of the trade battles with China and with the rest of the world wind up in the short term seeming to be quite difficult for large sections of American industry, for example.
Mm-hmm. And we should say, for people who may not know the lay of the kind of opinion media land, that to say that you were editor of the American Conservative is to say that you were tapped into this before it was cool, so to speak, or at least before it was cool among Republicans. I mean, the American Conservative, the magazine you edited, is associated with kind of Buchananite, in the sense of Pat Buchanan, conservatism. And, decades ago, he was saying, free trade is damaging our economy. He's an immigration restrictionist. He's, I guess you could say, a Burkean conservative, in the sense that he just doesn't want things to change very fast. Is that, you're not nodding your head, so maybe correct me on that.
Well, your general characterization seems fair. Everyone calls themselves a Burkean conservative, so in some ways that label's been emptied.
There are the kind of free market purists, the kind of libertarians who are sometimes called conservatives, but are obviously advocating things that will make things change faster. They're advocating economics, a kind of that will continue to kind of change the world rapidly. Right.
I think that's right. I mean, Pat Buchanan and Edmund Burke would both be people who see that there's a need to have stability as well as change, and for those things to kind of work in a certain rhythm or harmony, as opposed to being entirely fluid and changing. There's Pat Buchanan, who had been one of the co-founders of the American Conservative back in 2002. But also, I mean, there was an era in the 1990s, especially the early 90s, when Ross Perot was also outlining many of these themes. And among the Democrats, you had people like Dick Gephardt and, in fact, Ralph Nader, who you mentioned earlier, talking about many of these questions as well. And in the mid to late 90s, and then going into the 2000s, you had this kind of bipartisan consensus form, where you may have had disagreements over various social questions like gay marriage, but in terms of free trade, to some degree in terms of immigration, on the whole question of the basic economic structure of the country, you had a tremendous amount of agreement between leading Democrats and leading Republicans, which extended into foreign policy as well. And I think it's quite telling. The Iraq War is seen as George W. Bush's project. It's something that John Kerry voted for. It's something that Joe Biden voted for. It's something that Hillary Clinton voted for. It was something that both parties had converged on, this idea that we had the power to kind of reconstruct and manage other countries.
Okay. Just one more point about Buchanan, because I think I'm sure you're going to say that I know you believe that the stereotype prevalent in parts of the resistance that Trump voters are driven by racism and bigotry is wrong. But just to drill down on that, I want to get back to it. I want to talk about a memory I have of Buchanan, something he wrote that kind of set people off. I first of all, I take the point that you can be concerned about the short-term impact of, say, low-wage immigration on the job prospects for relatively unskilled workers in America without being a racist. You can just size that up analytically and have a genuine concern for the fate of the working class and so on. But I remember something Buchanan wrote about. It was about I lived in Washington at the time. In fact, I met Pat Buchanan once, and it was about you would have these street musicians. And some of them were like drummers, and some of them were from Africa, and they were doing kind of a bongo type thing. And he kind of went off on that. He's like, "This is America." It's like, I don't know if he said like, what is this, like Zulu America or something? But there was very much that vibe to what he said. And that was a little different. I mean, and maybe this gets back to Burkeanism. I don't know, just the pace of cultural change, whether you can assimilate it. But he was clearly reacting to something there other than the effects of immigration on wages. It seemed to be a kind of opposition to diversity, because there are people who walk through Washington. I feel like this sometimes in Washington, in New York, and you hear all this different kinds of music, and I think, hey, it's great that people can come together from, and you have this melting pot and so on. He had a very different kind of reaction. Now, do you think he needn't be defensive about that reaction? It's a perfectly legit reaction. Maybe you have it, or what? And how do you think this bears on the whole kind of racism allegation that you get, or bigotry or whatever, from the resistance?
Yeah, I don't remember the specific Buchanan reference that you're making, but in general, I know what you're talking about, and it's something you could also find in terms of things that Tom Wolfe had said, for example. And it's this idea of what some people have called cultural difference, and the idea that there is, it's easier to assimilate people who are relatively closer to you culturally from countries that may have linguistic and religious and simply, other cultural connections with you that are closer than those of more distant cultures. And that, of course, is going to necessarily, just because of the way the world has developed for a few thousand years, overlap a great deal with geography, which is going to overlap a great deal with race. And so anyone who wants to point to someone making that kind of cultural argument and say, you know what, this is not really a cultural argument, this is really a racial argument, because you're seeing racial differences here as well as cultural ones. It's very easy to make that kind of claim and then, paint your opponent in this kind of debate as being a racist. I actually am a little skeptical of some of the aspects of the whole cultural assimilation question and cultural difference. The thing I tend to focus on is that when you have newcomers to America, it's not that they are necessarily bringing a culture that is going to be, not adding, positively to America. It's rather that they come without having a lot of the ideas and habits that Americans have come to take for granted, and especially conservative Americans, right? So, for example, on Second Amendment questions, I think there is a fear that as people come to this country, they're coming from places, and this includes Europe as much as anywhere else, that don't have the kind of culture of the Second Amendment that you find here in the United States, which is almost unique. And that therefore this is a way to, over time, erode the commitment that Americans have to some of their, commitments in the Bill of Rights. So I worry about that.
Let me just say, I've actually never heard that one before. The idea that, and is that out there kind of in the heartland, the fear that maybe I'm overstating it, making it sound crazier than you meant it, but that immigration is a plot to take people's guns away? Am I over?
Well, that's stating it very bluntly, but no, it's a plot to take their rights away. You would probably hear that. The idea that, you're getting a population which is not grounded in the kind of Republican traditions, small R Republican traditions, that Americans take for granted. And that's not the fault of the immigrants. But then the question becomes, even if you're having assimilation, it's assimilation into what, and conducted by what educational institutions and what sorts of,
but it's, yeah,
cultural mediation.
I guess I can kind of see that. I was just wondering, like, are the kinds of immigrants these people that Trump supporters tend to express concern about, do they tend to come from more authoritarian countries or less? And I guess maybe it's kind of a mix. A lot of them, a number of them do, I guess, come from countries with less robust.
Well, but even there, I wouldn't say it's necessarily that the immigrants are bringing, authoritarian traditions or something like that. It's rather that when they come, they don't have the particular mix of, again, small R Republican characteristics that Americans tend to take for granted, that are kind of ingrained within our culture. And, I don't want to make it seem as if there is a sort of a singular small R Republicanism. Obviously, on the left and the right, you get very different variations of that among Americans. But I do think a lot of big R Republicans and a lot of conservatives are worried that there is an engineering process going on here, trying to change the way Americans think, by bringing in people who don't have the kind of grounding that, either that big R Republicans have in small R Republicanism, let me put it that way. And so, when you have a popular culture and an educational apparatus that is primarily in the hands of people who are left of center or progressive, that's going to have a very strong effect on newcomers to the country. It's going to really, sort of provide them with their understanding of America. And it's going to be much harder for people, out in the heartland who are these, again, don't feel represented by our institutions politically or culturally, to be able to assimilate immigrants to their culture.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, here we reach an irony, which is that if indeed the motivation for some support for Trump is the fear that liberties will be taken away, that's also the motivation for a certain amount of opposition to Trump, right? They think of him as an authoritarian, and he has certainly said things that could corroborate that kind of concern. I think you'll agree, whether it's, just flat out kind of demonizing the media and vaguely threatening consequences for various kinds of things, or whatever, or the use of his bully pulpit to attack the owners of certain media, and then of course his relatively aggressive enforcement of immigration law and so on. Do you think those concerns are unfounded? And also, just how comfortable are you personally with that part of Trump?
I'm pretty comfortable with that personally. When it comes to criticizing media barons and the media itself, again, this is a very powerful institution. These are, very wealthy individuals. Jeff Bezos is someone who has plenty of power to defend himself. And it seems like there's a lot of Americans who have gripes against Jeff Bezos, whether they're working in his, warehouses, or whether they're, in my case, getting books in the mail that are all bent up and smashed up because Amazon.com is very sort of complacent about its customer service. So, to have the president simply speaking out and criticizing, someone like Bezos doesn't seem problematic to me.
Okay, just to drill in on that, there is some evidence that Trump personally steered a Pentagon contract away from Amazon toward Microsoft because he doesn't like the Washington Post. It's circumstantial evidence, but I assume you'd be uncomfortable with that.
It's not the I think you have to take everything into account when you're doing things like Pentagon contracting. And if you think that there is, something dangerous about the way that this complex of companies, a contractor for the military that's also got political sway through a newspaper that also has, plenty of other resources at its disposal, why shouldn't you take all that into consideration?
Yeah, but I seriously, I asked this question kind of with respect to the whole Ukraine thing. Do you really think Trump was not fundamentally motivated by his political interests? Here, do you really think Trump was not motivated by the fact that he hates the Washington Post and Bezos owns it? Again, Trump has not evinced any kind of general concern for the principles that you're saying might have motivated him, right? Whereas he has repeatedly shown himself to be very much motivated by personal grievance. Isn't it more plausible that in this case, he's pissed off about the Washington Post and he's going to punish Jeff Bezos? Don't you take that as a kind of a sound reading of the kind of person he is? I'm not saying we know for sure what happened in this case, but it just seems to me you're being pretty generous in your attribution of motivation here.
Well, the difference here is that I see it as being personal, but it's a personal motive which has an institutional effect, right? So I'm saying that basically, I think of this in a kind of Madisonian term, right? You have to have interests that are self-interested and that are actually competing to have their own voice heard. And then, in the interplay between them and the conflicts between them, you might get something that serves the public. So one of the things that I think is interesting about the Trump phenomenon is that Trump is breaking down this kind of, sort of early 20th century Wilsonian good government view that you can have impersonal scientific administration of the country from bureaucrats and from, a contracting process that's going to be totally unpolitical. I think all of that was a bit of a sham from the beginning. Not that, the people responsible for it didn't sometimes have very good motives, but that the whole idea that you could remove politics from these key questions was false. And that, in fact, you should be there can be a legitimate amount of politics here. You can have a little bit of the spoil system. The key thing is that the public be aware of this, that you have a vigorous press that's able to get that out. And that vigorous press that's able to get that out may or may not be a press that's owned by, one of the major contractors like Amazon, like Jeff Bezos.
Yeah. I guess I'd agree that it's naive to think that you could ever realize the ideal of disinterested anything, whether it's journalism or government. But at the same time, it seems to me in trying to, it makes sense to try to come as close to that as you can. And part of trying to come close to it is to kind of insist that you go through the motions, so to speak, right? That you, well, even to, I don't know what I want to say exactly. I do want to say that I think norms are important, and that calling people out when they manifestly depart from the, when they're just manifestly petty in their motivations, I guess, and to discourage almost the admission of pettiness. I mean, that's the thing about Trump. And see, I think this is what a lot of people like about him. He says the quiet part out loud, right? He just says, yeah, I'm totally in this for myself. And so are the rest of the politicians. They're just not telling you about it. They're just not being honest. I mean, he doesn't quite say that, but don't you think that one thing, during the campaign, the 2016 campaign, liberals kept saying, wait a second, politicians don't talk like this. Why aren't they outraged? And of course, that was exactly what they liked about Trump. Politicians don't talk like that. And they had become so cynical, and I think largely with justification, so cynical about the average American politician that they took candor about motivation as a sign of refreshing departure from the hypocrisy of most politicians, right? Don't you think that's part of the story here?
Oh, I totally do. I very much agree with that. And I think it's healthy and necessary that you need to get back to a little bit more open conflict as opposed to a consensus, which in fact is not a neutral consensus. It's not a purely public interested, scientific, advantageous consensus, but that in fact is a consensus that favors certain people over others. And that's where, this critique of, I think, the educated professional classes comes in, that they have pursued an agenda that's actually very good if you, own some of the capital instruments that they may own. It's very good if you have the kind of status that you get from going along with the consensus of your fellow educated Americans. But all of that winds up leaving behind large numbers of people, not just, the Donald Trump base, but actually, a lot of Americans all the way down the line. So, and this is why I think you're seeing the rise of people like Bernie Sanders, to some degree, other Democrats as well, who started to be a little more confrontational and raise some of these fundamental conflicts in our society. For too long, we've papered over these differences and tried to depoliticize them and make them administrative rather than open and interested. And I think it's time to make the interests much more obvious.
Yeah, at the same time, I mean, I think it's an interesting question when candor about motivation is a virtue and when it's a vice. I mean, there is this old saying that I don't think I've ever entirely understood. What is it? Hypocrisy is the tribute that virtue pays the vice. Is that it?
Yeah.
So tell me if this is a good example of what is. I'm really honestly not sure I understand exactly what that means, but I do think there are cases when kind of covering up actual motivation is a good thing. And what I mean by that, what I'm thinking of specifically is the question of how we talk about the judiciary. So one thing I've noticed in the age of Trump, I think it is more often the case now that when the media report about a judge's ruling, they report about whether the judge was a Democratic appointee or a Republican appointee. And I think on the one hand, there's a kind of validity to doing that because obviously you will find some correlation, right, between which party appointed a judge and how they will rule. At the same time, I think being public and upfront about that can, over the long term, erode respect for the judiciary. And I think there's virtue in a society treating the judiciary with a certain kind of reverence or respect, even if the judiciary is perhaps a little less deserving of that than is kind of officially the case. And I worry a little about a society where every court ruling is viewed cynically as an expression of partisan kind of imperative. Do you think I'm wrong about that?
Well, it's something that's connected to much larger questions in American politics. So certainly if you go back to the 1790s and the 1800s, you find a high degree of partisanship and partisan perspectives, and you look through partisan lenses at the way the court is operating, right? So a lot of the Jeffersonians thought that the Federalist Court and the sort of deliberate court-packing initiatives on the part of the Adams administration had sort of short-circuited the Jeffersonian revolution, and that the court was a very political entity at that time. And, in the mid-20th century, and actually maybe not the mid-20th century, but earlier on, early 20th century, there are these phases where the court has a bit more of this august respectability than at other times in American politics. But the tendency for the court to become embroiled in political questions, again, I think this goes back to our founding. This is something which the very nature of our institutions almost guarantees that this is going to happen. And it goes to the fundamental question of, is America a democracy? Is it based fundamentally on the people arguing among themselves and then choosing what direction they want to take? Or is there, in fact, this sort of expert class that needs to be there, making the right decision, removed from popular, self-interested deliberation? And the fact is, our constitutional system has elements of both of these things, so you get something of a pendulum swinging from side to side. I think we've gone, too far in the direction of expertise for too long here, and there is a need to kind of repoliticize some of these questions. Ultimately, what should happen is that the court should be and courts in general should be less involved in these questions, and they should go back to the legislatures, go back to the voters, go back to the realm of public argument.
I see. So in this scenario, cultivating the idea that courts are very political is part of what you would like to see as a process of reducing the role of courts in our lives.
That's right.
Okay, I hadn't thought about it that way, because it does seem to me that it's just kind of not. At the same time, you would probably acknowledge that when societies fall apart and move toward like actual civil war, something that neither of us would want, it probably is often part of the process that there's more and more cynicism toward things like the courts. Certainly Trump has cultivated that, right? I guess I'm saying, do you really think it's healthy, and maybe you're saying you do, for him to convince his supporters that every time a court ruling goes against him, it's a conspiracy of the Democratic Party, and every time the courts rule in favor of him, that's the triumph of truth? That is his view.
Yeah, but he doesn't have to convince his supporters of that, and many of them have believed that for a very long time. And Donald Trump is, again, saying...
He has influence, don't you think, on the intensity of views within his base, the prevalence of the views?
Well, he does, but conservatives have been very unhappy with the courts for a very long time and have had precisely that view, that you need to have a shakeup in the courts. You need to have an organization like the Federalist Society putting in new kinds of judges and new kinds of justices, ultimately, because the courts before that had been slanted to a certain progressive or liberal viewpoint. But you're right. You can have a country break apart because it becomes too polarized, because there become these, this sense that there's no legitimate government and that, your own faction is the only thing that has any legitimacy. But you can also have revolutionary situations emerge from the other extreme, where you get a ruling class which is unresponsive to the demands of the public and which insulates itself to such a degree that the public winds up feeling completely unrepresented and willing to overturn the institutions. So I think this is the sort of pendulum that's swinging back from sort of expert rule and a sense that norms that no one really voted on, right? These are norms that exist among the governing class themselves. Well, the public is starting to express more reservations about these norms and say, wait a minute, do we ever get a say here? Do we ever get to actually express our own discontent with the way these things have gone?
What's a good example of an issue where that comes to the fore?
Well, again, I think trade, I think immigration, I think healthcare policy, if you're on the left, all of these things are, previously had been the realm of experts who tended to come to a consensus. You would have Obamacare, Romneycare, they'd be, within
but I will say most of those were pretty clear-cut legislative mandates, right? Those aren't cases where the courts weighing in made a big difference.
That's right.
I mean,
with the courts,
arguably healthcare, but anyway, is there a good example of an issue in where the courts where I mean, obviously, I guess you're thinking Roe versus Wade or something, right?
Roe versus Wade, questions of religious liberty. I mean, all of these things are, sort of, they're political battles. They're things where, half the public says one thing, half the public says another. I think they should openly, sort of debate their positions and, have a political process of resolving them, as opposed to expecting the courts to be able to provide a ruling from on high that's going to satisfy everyone.
Okay, so just kind of in closing, so you're pretty happy with a lot of the substantive positions that Trump, broadly speaking, takes. I mean, on trade, Second Amendment, immigration.
Foreign policy is a big one there, too.
I was going to say foreign policy. There, of course, I assume you're more happy with his talk than his walk, at least in the sense that he actually is increasing the number of troops in the Middle East in the end, and so on. I mean, he famously, from the point of view of someone who wants less military intervention, he famously kind of takes one step forward, two steps backward, and keeps getting overrun by the foreign policy establishment, so far as I can tell. Is that a fair?
There's a lot of truth to that. On the other hand, he's someone who stayed out of creating new conflicts when there was plenty of pressure on him to, get into Syria. Well, there was plenty of pressure on him to do more with Iran than he actually has.
Unless you account assassinating a military commander from Iran and having Iran fire missiles from Iran into an American base in Iraq as a new conflict, which I'd say it is, even if it hasn't become full-fledged war. But
well, I say it isn't, in part because Soleimani, of course, had played a pretty significant role during the Iraq conflict, and he still has been playing a disruptive role within the region. Iran, they took a gauge of how far they could push back, and they were very careful not to trigger the kind of retaliation that might have come about. Donald Trump himself, you'll notice that, again, there's this personal element to him, right? So he decided personally that he was going to, target Soleimani as an individual. But on the other hand, Trump had refrained from using force in such a way as to, fire missiles that would lead to casualties among the fighting men of, either Iranian forces or earlier Syrian forces. He's actually been very careful not to attack. It seems to me that he has a very it'd take a while to explain his approach to this. I think he wants to personalize these conflicts and make them less about peoples fighting peoples and more about leaders, negotiating with or even assassinating perhaps other leaders.
Okay, so
which I think is a healthy move, actually. So
wait, so say that again. Make sure I understand that.
Well, look, again, it's a matter of whether we're dealing with systems and we think that everything can be dealt with at a systematic level, or that there are personalities that matter most here. When we have these losing wars that we've been fighting, so we've been in Afghanistan for nearly 20 years. Mm-hmm. We've been, messing around in Iraq to one degree or another, actually for nearly 30, going back all the way to the first Gulf War. We've been doing it in a systematic way. We've been saying, well, if we kill this number of insurgents, it's almost like the way we did it with Vietnam, where we had these metrics and we had these approaches that really never led to any kind of conclusion. With Donald Trump, I think he sees it as, what kind of pressure can you actually put on the leaders of a country like Iran, for example, that's going to get them to change their ways? Because simply killing soldiers on the field is not going to do it. And the Soleimani strike, I think, is part of that strategy. Now, he's not a general himself. He's not someone who necessarily is an IR specialist or something like that, obviously. So we'll find out, where this kind of make it up strategy goes. But I think, if you look at the failing strategy that we've had from the generals for so long, it's time for a change. And, if he's doing a more personal kind of negotiation with the Kim dynasty in North Korea, that too is a change that's worth trying, because what we've been doing before had simply led to the Kims acquiring nuclear weapons and, increasing missile capability.
So you're fine with what's sometimes called a Jacksonian foreign policy, then, which I take, or national security policy, which I take to mean not so much in the way of multilateral commitment, certainly not so much in the way of large-scale military interventions, but a real willingness to strike out unilaterally as you wish, unconstrained by international law, I think is part of the deal. And even maybe to do so unpredictably as a way to increase fear of you, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I might put it differently, but in general, yes.
Am I right in thinking that that's what people mean by Jacksonian, the reference being to Andrew Jackson? A, and B, do you approve?
Yeah, this is, I mean, Walter Russell Mead, many years ago, about 20 years ago now, wrote a book characterizing American foreign policy approaches according to several early presidents and leading figures. There's a Jacksonian, a Jeffersonian, a Hamiltonian, and then ultimately a Wilsonian approach to these foreign policy questions. In many ways, I'm actually probably more of a Hamiltonian than I am a Jacksonian. But what you've described as being the Jacksonian approach of Donald Trump is within the right ballpark, I would say.
Okay, so you're not entirely approving of it because you are more of a Hamiltonian, which means a little less militaristic than Trump is being?
I think the key world struggle we're in right now is an economic war with China. And that's a war involving technology. It's a war involving economic leverage. It's a war involving the scale of our industrial bases. It's not a shooting war, and it's not likely to be one, and we hope it doesn't become one. So I want to see most of our energy applied towards that question. And I think the Middle East is a place where we've been trying this Wilsonian strategy for about 20 years. Mm-hmm. It's gone nowhere, and it's time to get out of that. And maybe the Jacksonian strategy that Donald Trump has, adopted for the Middle East is going to expedite our leaving there more quickly than a Wilsonian strategy would. But is it perfect? No, I wouldn't say so.
Well, that's why I raised Iran as a question for you as to whether that really is the Soleimani strike really was such a great thing. I mean, as I recall, Pat Buchanan's basic critique of American foreign policy, he saw our involvement in the Middle East, broadly speaking, as confused, and I think would have seen possibly the Soleimani strike in that way. But let me so let's just step back and just as a final kind of question. You wrote a piece called "The Case for Genghis Trump" in The Spectator, where you kind of said, okay, he may not use the right fork to eat his salad or whatever, so to speak. Okay, he's uncouth, but he just as the barbarians inflicted suffering on civilization at times when arguably civilization needed to take Western civilization needed to take a look within and see that it needed to reform certain things, that whether it had become decadent or corrupt or whatever, he is on balance a healthy influence. Okay. I took that as you implicitly acknowledging that there are things about Trump that even you don't especially like. But on balance, his very crudeness is exerting a healthy influence. So let me, rather than ask you to pursue that thesis, that he's on balance a healthy influence, let's just stipulate that maybe you're right about that and ask you to talk about the flip side of the coin. What are the things that make you uncomfortable about Donald Trump? In other words, if you imagine a day in the future when, okay, Genghis Khan has come and exerted what you see as a healthy influence on civilization, and we have a version of Donald Trump that you would like to see in office after this, I don't know, catharsis or whatever the hell we're going through is from your point of view, in what ways would that Trump be different from this Trump? What are the things that you find kind of most gratuitously unpleasant or something about Trump, or even out and out unhealthy about the nature of this president? What are your reservations about him in that sense?
My strongest reservation involves his personnel picks, which in many cases have been conventional Republicans or even neoconservatives who have undercut what I think are the virtues of Donald Trump and have sort of inserted instead the same vices that we had seen not only in previous Republican administrations, but to some extent even among Democrats too. So Donald Trump's ability to disrupt things, ability to sort of reopen questions that need to be reopened in terms of fundamentally what our economic policies are, what our foreign policies are. This has been undone somewhat or stifled by the very people he's put around him. And this extends not only to people like John Bolton, for example, not only people like perhaps Brian Hook with respect to Iran policy, but also, I mean, you look at some of these, the way that Rudy Giuliani has behaved with respect to the whole Ukrainian business. I mean, Giuliani just seems like a loose cannon at this point. I mean, the idea that you
might say
load him up and just let him fire away, and I think there's this tendency among Democrats to say anything Giuliani did must have been, directed by Trump. I don't think that's the case. I think Giuliani's actually quite a, sort of troublesome figure in his own right here. And then obviously, beyond that, you've got a lot of others who, are similarly troubling. So, there are those personnel questions. And then there's also that Donald Trump is someone who's better at disruption than he is at creation. He's someone better at sort of brand promotion, and I mean that in a kind of nice way, not just in terms of Donald Trump as an entertainment brand, but Donald Trump as a brand who in politics kind of represents a forgotten segment of America. I think there's something healthy in that. But you can't just represent a brand. You actually do have to build the buildings. You actually have to provide the services. Now, a friend of mine who's a member of one of Donald Trump's golf courses says that, in fact, Trump has done a very good job of, sort of managing this golf course. But I think in terms of politics, we haven't seen that yet. We haven't seen the constructive phase. We haven't seen the ability to, not just attack a kind of liberal establishment or a corrupt establishment, but to build sort of new, systems that would be helpful for American foreign policy, for economics, and for sort of cultural harmony. So Donald Trump is a beginning, but there has to be this other more constructive phase later on.
Okay, and at a more personal level, do you not find him just the kind of person you wouldn't like? You know what I mean? He's just he insults people personally a whole lot. He seems to be driven largely by personal grievance and so on. I mean, isn't he the kind of kid you wouldn't have liked in high school? Do you not react to him at that level like that?
Well, I think if we're being honest here, I mean, we've all had friends who are obstreperous or, who are troublemakers. Mm-hmm. The idea that kind of personality isn't in fact, doesn't have a place in the world and isn't something that people have a certain amount of, enjoyment of, I think is mistaken. No, while there are, personal insults, I don't like Donald Trump doing that. There are times he says, various things that I don't like. But his overall attitude, I don't find necessarily to be worse than the kind of go along to get along, highly, polished and hypocritical approach that other politicians take. So Donald Trump is, in terms of character, not a role model, not someone I'd say, hey, kids, you should be just like this guy. But I would actually say that as a politician, I prefer what he's doing. And we talked about this a little bit earlier in terms of, getting back to a more sort of sincere or direct kind of politics. I prefer what he's doing to the kind of very polished and disingenuous approach that we see from everyone else. They may be polite, they may never call anyone a name, but what they're doing is actually quite poisonous to the country.
Okay, well, thank you so much for taking the time. I hope, you'll have time to come back again down the road, because I think it's very healthy to get your perspective, which you articulate very well. And as I said, you were a Trumpist in not in all respects, but I think in fundamental ideological respects when before it was such a thing. And so where can people find your? They can go to the American Spectator, they can go to the American Conservative, they can just Google you. What's your Twitter handle?
Tory Anarchist.
Tory Anarchist.
That's correct.
I'm at Robert Writer on Twitter, WRIGHTER. Thanks so much, and I hope we can talk down the road.
Thanks, Bob.
All right, take care.